Are the Christian Gospels historically reliable? This is such an important question for faith and for our knowledge and understanding of one of the most important individuals in human history. And so we need to turn to a guide who is truly an expert in the New Testament and the historical Jesus. And I intend to share with you the research of Professor Bart Ehrman, who is the Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's author of more than 20 books and is recognized as a master explainer of the issues to do with the Gospels and the New Testament. He has written this book, How Jesus Became God, the exaltation of a Jewish preacher from Galilee. And there's so much amazing information here that I might take several videos to explain many different aspects of this subject that he explores. But in this video, I just want to talk about the problems with the Gospels. So what important point I want to make here is that I happen to know that what Bart Ehrman says in this chapter is totally mainstream. If you study the subject at any mainstream university, be it Oxford or Cambridge or Edinburgh in Britain or Yale or Harvard or whatever in the United States, you will find very similar things being taught by the leading scholars of the day. He is not a maverick. This is not marginal or eccentric. This is totally mainstream academic scholarship. Now, it doesn't mean you should accept it uncritically, of course. We must think these things through for ourselves. But nevertheless, we're dealing with someone who has a reputation for explaining in a very accessible way the often obscure subject of New Testament scholarship. So when we look at the problems with the Gospels, Bart Ehrman says this. What we want, he says, if we want historically reliable accounts, are sources that can be traced back to Jesus' own time. We want ancient sources. So to use the Islamic language, we want isnads. We want to know where this information came from, who passed it to whom, did they exist, are they reliable characters, and we want to know that there is a traceable narration that goes from A to B to C. He says, we do of course have ancient sources, but they are not as ancient as we would like. Our very first Christian author is the Apostle Paul, who was writing 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death. A number of Paul's letters are included in the New Testament. Other Christian authors may have been writing earlier than Paul, but none of their work survives. The problems with Paul are that he didn't actually know Jesus personally, and that he doesn't tell us very much about Jesus' teaching, activities, or experiences. I sometimes give my students an assignment to read through all of Paul's writings and list everything Paul indicates Jesus said and did. My students are surprised to find that they don't even need a 3x5 card to list them. Paul, by the way, never says that Jesus declared himself to be divine. Our next earliest sources of information about the historical Jesus, of course, are the Gospels of the New Testament. As it turns out, these are our best sources. They are best not because they happen to be in the New Testament, but because they are also the earliest narratives of Jesus' life to survive. Even though they are the best sources available to us, they really are not as good as we might hope. This is for several reasons. To begin with, they are not written by eyewitnesses. Now, this, when one first comes across this idea in scholars, it's quite shocking. What do you mean Matthew is not written by the Apostle Matthew? Of course he was. Or John, of course it was written by the Apostle John, and so on. And it's quite a shock to, I remember it was to me some time ago, to learn actually the historians do not think that they are written by eyewitnesses. And Bart Ehrman explains why. We call these books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because they are named after two of Jesus' earthly disciples, Matthew the tax collector and John the Baptist and John the beloved disciple, and two of the close companions of other apostles, Mark the secretary of Peter and Luke the travelling companion of Paul. But in fact the books were written anonymously. The authors never identify themselves, and they circulated for decades before anyone claimed they were written by these people. The first certain attribution of these books to these authors is a century after they were produced. And Bart Ehrman doesn't mention, but the earliest records we have are people like Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century, who has the Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Mark. And this is the end of the 2nd century, not in the first half of the 1st century. There are good reasons for thinking that none of these attributions is right. For one thing, the followers of Jesus, as we learn from the New Testament itself, were uneducated, lower-class, Aramaic-speaking Jews from Palestine. In other words, they were peasants, in the sociological sense. They were uneducated, lower-class, Aramaic-speaking Jews from Palestine, remember? These books are not written by people like that. Their authors were highly educated, Greek-speaking Christians of a later generation. They probably wrote after Jesus' disciples had all or almost all died. They were writing in different parts of the world, in a different language at a later time. There's not much mystery about why later Christians would want to claim that the authors were in fact companions of Jesus, or at least connected with the apostles. That claim provided much needed authority for these accounts, for people wanting to know what Jesus was really like. Scholars typically date the New Testament Gospels to the latter part of the 1st century. Almost everyone would agree that Jesus died sometime around 30 AD. Mark was the first Gospel to be written, probably around 65 to 70 AD. Matthew and Luke were written about 15 to 20 years after that, say 80 to 85 AD. John was written last, around 90 to 95 AD. What is significant is the huge gap involved. The very first surviving account of Jesus' life was written 35 to 40 years after his death. Our last canonical gospel was written 60 to 65 years after his death. That's obviously a lot of time. If the authors were not eyewitnesses and were not from Palestine and did not even speak the same language as Jesus, where did they get their information? So back to the Muslim question of isnad. What is the source? How do we know it's reliable? Here again, there's not a lot of agreement among critical scholars. After Jesus died, his followers came to believe that he was raised from the dead, and they saw it as their mission to convert people to the belief that the death and resurrection of Jesus were the death and resurrection of God's Messiah, and that by believing in his death and resurrection, a person could have eternal life. The early Christian witnesses to Jesus had to persuade people that Jesus really was the Messiah from God, and to do that they had to tell stories about him. So they did. They told stories about what happened at the end of his life, the crucifixion, the empty tomb, his appearances to his followers alive afterwards. They also told stories of his life before those final events, what he taught, the miracles he performed, the controversies he had with the Jewish leaders, his arrest and trial, and so on. These stories circulated. Anyone who converted to become a follower of Jesus could and did tell the stories. A neighbour would tell his wife. If she converted, she would tell her neighbour. If she converted, she would tell her husband. If he converted, he would tell his business partner. If he converted, he would take a business trip to another city and tell his business associate. If he converted, he would tell his wife. If she converted, she would tell her neighbour, and on and on. Telling stories was the only way to communicate in the days before mass communication, national media coverage, and even significant levels of literacy. At that time, only 10% of the population could read and write, so almost all communication was oral. Who then was telling the stories about Jesus? Just the apostles? It can't just have been the apostles. Just the people whom the apostles authorized? No way. Just the people who checked their facts to make sure they didn't change any of the stories, but only recounted events that really happened and as they happened? How could they do that? The stories have been told by word of mouth, year after year, decade after decade, among lots of people in different parts of the world, in different languages. and there was no way to control what one person said to the next about Jesus' words and deeds. Everyone knows what happens to stories that circulate in this way. Details get changed, episodes get invented, events get exaggerated, impressive accounts get made even more impressive, and so on. Eventually, an author heard the stories in his church. Say it was Mark in the city of Rome, and he wrote his account. And 10 or 15 years later, another author in another city read Mark's account and decides to write his own, based primarily or partially on Mark's account, but partially on the stories he had heard in his own community. And the Gospels started coming into existence. Those are the Gospels we now have. Scholars for 300 years and more have studied them in minute detail, and one of the assured results of this intensive investigation is the certainty that the Gospels have numerous discrepancies, contradictions, and historical problems. Why would that be? It would be better to ask, how could that not be? Of course the Gospels contain non-historical information and stories that have been modified and exaggerated and embellished. These books do not contain the words of someone who was sitting at Jesus' feet taking notes. They are nothing like that. They are books that are intending to tell the good news of Jesus. The word gospel means good news in Greek. That is, their authors had a vested interest both in what they are telling and in how they are telling it. They wanted to preach Jesus. They were not trying to give biographical information that would pass muster among critical historians living 2,000 years later who have developed significantly different standards of writing history or historiography. They are writing for their own day and were trying to convince people about the truth, as they saw it, about Jesus. They were basing their stories on what they had heard and read. What they had read was based on what the authors of these writings had heard. It all goes back to oral tradition. Some people today claim that cultures rooted in oral tradition are far more careful to make certain that traditions that are told and retold are not changed significantly. This turns out to be a modern myth, however. Anthropologists who have studied oral cultures show just the opposite is the case. Only literary cultures have a concern for exact replication of the facts as they really are. And this is because in literary cultures it is possible to check the sources to see whether someone has changed the story. In oral cultures, it is widely expected that stories will indeed change. They change any time a storyteller is telling a story in a new context. New contexts require new ways of telling stories. Thus, oral cultures historically have seen no problem with altering accounts as they were told and retold. So, of course, there are discrepancies, embellishments, made-up stories, and historical problems in the Gospels. And this means that they cannot be taken at face value as giving us historically accurate accounts of what really happened. Does this mean the Gospels are useless? No. It means that we need to have a rigorous historical methodology to help us examine books that were written for one purpose, to proclaim the good news of Jesus, to achieve a different purpose, to know what Jesus really said and did. And that is Bart Ehrman. As I say, this is totally mainstream. That's what you'll learn about at university if you study this subject academically. And if you want to study this for yourself, this is the best introductory book, The Historical Figure of Jesus by E.P. Saunders. He's America's most distinguished scholar in the field of Jesus research. And this is commonly seen as the best go-to academic introduction to the historical figure of Jesus. E.P. Saunders, I put a link in the description below for you. Until next time.